Let's turn to our first painting. We have quite a bit to cover today because we're doing the Art of Holy Week, which is an extraordinarily rich topic in art history and in the life of the church. So this first entry or first painting is by Duccio once again. And this is the entry of Jesus into the city of Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And I think this is a wonderfully exciting and interesting piece of art because you can really see in this artwork that Duccio is moving past the sort of flat, iconic presentation of religious scenes that was common in the Middle Ages and adding some humor to this particular scene. Can we find the humor? Check out the trees. Okay, so Jesus is coming into the city of Jerusalem, and here he is on the donkey with his halo on. And then up in the trees, we have these naughty boys, you know, who are throwing apples or pears down to their friends. Do you see them up here? And the kids down here? Yeah. It does sort of look that way, but despite this great holy event that's happening, we have these kids that are just being normal, you know, teenage, 12-year-old boys with the little ants in their pants. And it's just sort of sweet. And he's really stacked up the scenes. In terms of there's this scene down here, there's Jesus here, and that's an empty door or an open door. And then there's here with the boys and the trees, and then there's the city with the cathedral on top. So he's really stacked it up vertically to get a lot in this long, narrow frame. And this particular piece of art is a smaller piece of art. And it's part of the Meister altarpiece in Siena. And it was painted by Duccio in 1308 to 1311. So it's the very, very late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, in a transition period. This is a huge piece of art that stands about 10 feet tall and is about 8 feet wide. And on the front, there is a Madonna and Child. On the back, there are all these scenes of events that occurred during Holy Week. And on the bottom of the front, on what's called the predella, there are scenes from the life of Christ. So this is a huge teaching event for teaching people about the life of Christ. So you can imagine going to Sunday school in a church like this, how nice this would be for Pastor John just to keep pointing at the scenes. No problem. What happened here? What's going on there? And during this time, many of the people were illiterate and did not read books. So you really had to bring the stories alive in artwork to make it land with the people. That's why there were so many stained glass windows depicting the life of Christ and biblical scenes, and that's why there's so much artwork in the church. This is a teaching device. How do you like this painting? Yeah, so it's active, it's beautiful, the colors are exciting. There's a lot of drama in this painting. Jesus is going uphill, the people are coming down, the disciples are behind him. And then there's all this activity in the trees. Yes, John? Oh, you're in charge?
I'm supposed to be in charge of this thing. So the tree in the bottom right-hand corner is just oddly shaped. So I just caught my eye, and I'm not sure we see the whole thing or not.
Yeah,
So,
I think it's a trained bush. I think that Duccio has added that
It's got like movement almost in the direction of where Christ is going. It's like
Yeah,
kind of
it
off to
really
the right.
draws your eyes to the right there. But it's a kind of topiary. So there would have been a lot of that kind of additional artwork in, expressed in plans in Siena at this time. Let's move on to the next one. Here's a whole different scene of Jesus's entry into Jerusalem. We've moved ahead 300 years, almost, 300 years. This is Anthony van Dyck, who's a Flemish painter. And he was an assistant to Peter Paul Rubens, the great Flemish painter as well. He became a master at the age of 17, and which is very, very young to have achieved master status in one of the painting guilds. He became a member of the Order of St. Luke, and he painted this painting at the age of 18. Okay, what do we notice in terms of the differences between this painting and the last painting? Okay, if you raise your hands, Pastor John will bring the mic around.
The color Jesus hope wears right now.
The colors are,
This garment there.
it's very bright red and very bright blue, yes. So as we've talked about in the past, red is always the dominant color in a picture. Your eyes are going to look there first. So it really announces Jesus as being the central figure. Okay, Ernie? Yep.
Yes, I'm looking at the definition of the faces. The previous painting was rather fuzzy in regards to the faces, but I see different expressions and emotions in the faces that he's drawn into this for me.
Yeah. We've moved into the Baroque period, and it's a much more emotive period than Duccio's period.
That man right in front, beside Jesus, that's holding a twig, that kind of intrigues me.
Yeah, and I think to some extent here that Van Dyck was showing off his knowledge of anatomy.
I always, whenever I see this painting, I always regret not getting royalties for my arm when I posed for this. I mean, I'd be so rich at this point. Joe?
I was going to mention the anatomy, and the definition of the anatomy, as well as what, like Ernie said, the depiction of the faces. Yeah.
Yeah.
What a dreamer. Just like Joseph, for sure, for sure. What I don't get is how come they're not happy? Why aren't they all happy? I don't understand. The joy is not in this picture.
Yeah, and people did not smile as much. If you go to Europe, people don't smile as much as they do here in America. People smile a lot. One of the other things that was different, even into the early 20th century, is that dental care was not widely available, so that people did not have good teeth. So until into the 20th century, when people started snapping photos all the time and Americans started being happy, there really are very few pictures of people smiling.
Yeah. This expression here has really got me. There's like this guy or this, it's like, this is weird. This is absurd. There's like skepticism. It's very interesting expression.
Yeah, and there is, even at this time, the Pharisaic representation or sort of delegation, and they were very skeptical and were reading in John, and they really had it in for Jesus. So they are skeptical as to what's going on. And it was foretold in the Old Testament that the Messiah would ride into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey or an ass. So Jesus is really acting out this particular scene or that particular prophecy in this scene. One thing I notice about it is this beautiful man, despite his anatomy, has really bad bunions. We've also moved into a far more of rounded figures. So the Duccio figures were much flatter in presentation, whereas here we're really seeing the roundness of the shapes. Yeah.
I don't know if this is true, but when I look at the head of the animal he's riding, I know it's a donkey, but looks a little more horse-like with the head. And just from what I know of scripture, it makes me think there was an interplay that he intentionally wasn't on a horse, but he was a king. And so just makes me wonder as I look at the face of the animal.
Okay, and there are two varieties. There's both the mules and the donkeys, and one is interbred with horses. And that was very common during the early Rome or the Roman Empire because the ones that were interbred with horses, even though they were sterile, they were larger and they were better for fighting wars. Yeah. Do you also notice how they're lined up? Everything is a linear representation. It reminds me of all the family pictures where I was told to stand in a line and pose so that my dad could take a picture of me and all my cousins or whatever. Okay, and it's also not such a large crowd of people. And the presentation is far more at the front. There's no foreground looking into this scene. There's really no background either. You don't get a horizon line where you're seeing much of the sky. You're just seeing these monumental figures. And this actually is a very large painting, 59.5 inches. So it's almost 5 feet tall, times 90. So it's a really long scene. I'm not good at my 12 times table, so I can't give you a sense of how long that is. 7.5 feet. Thank you, Jerry. Okay. You're better at your 12 times table than I am. Okay. Yeah. So, and we don't really have any real palms here. There's nothing. It's more of a twig rather than a palm. So it's more the flora that you would find in Flanders or Belgium nowadays. And the sky looks pretty dark and foreboding. Okay, it's not a nice sunny day there like we have today. Just a beautiful blessing from God today. And it's supposed to be 80 for Easter, which is a thrilling idea. So let's move on to the next slide. We've moved on to the Last Supper. And this is a tempera on canvas by William Blake, who is both a poet and an artist, and had a deeply felt belief in Jesus, in the faith. And he was part of the pre-Raphaelite or early pre-Raphaelite movement in Europe. He's an amazing poet, and he also does this amazing artwork. And this is a very different representation of the Last Supper. It is more in the form of, say, a Roman or a Greek banquet, okay, because they didn't sit up in chairs like we do. They ate reclining on like sectionals with these pillows tied, rolled up, or blankets rolled up beside them. So it was a very different kind of presentation in terms of a dinner party, but it's far more of the time if it were a high-end Roman banquet. Okay, here, hang on a second, Ernie.
The figures down front seem to be much more concerned about themselves as a couple than they are about Christ's presence. And it's just, it takes away. It just looks to me to be, we don't need it.
Oh, yeah. Well, can you find Judas here?
Right here.
Yeah, here's the money sack. This is Judas. Yeah.
Why is there a woman?
Well,
next to-
and
At the Last Supper. What,
it is the
does it-
Last Supper.
did she
and,
cook or something? What was
The question is that Mary Magdalene, or is that a more feminized representation of one of the disciples? Knowing William Blake, it's really hard to know. He was a manic depressive, or that's been sort of diagnosed post whatever. He had real big highs and real big lows. Okay, Lydia.
When I first saw it, it looked mystical to me, like it was maybe Hindu or, that's what first hit me.
So it's far more mystical in presentation. And we've moved past a pure, real representation of the Last Supper into a different kind of emphasis.
It almost makes me think about mermaids, the front figures and the top figures, not in a disrespectful way, but it makes me kind of, wonder the way their legs and their gowns are, they almost blend into like a mermaid tail. You can see the feet though.
Yeah. You've watched Ariel quite a number of times at this point in your life as a father, the Disney film. Okay, let's move on to the next one. And if you can find your handouts, and John Bailey, can I get you to come up here a second? At first, when I found this artwork online, I thought that I couldn't get a good representation of what it looked like. We're going to hold this on one on either side. Yeah, maybe Mark can pass around the mic. Okay. Or Mark can hold. Yeah. And then I realized after I ordered the poster and it arrived that this is really how the artist conceived of drawing the scene. This is an unusual representation of the Last Supper. First of all, there aren't 12 people here, there are 14. It's almost like he was doing this great dinner party scene and he couldn't bear to leave anyone out. It was interesting. I got here this morning and I was setting it up, and Julius came out to take a look at it and he said, "Oh, the brothers are all here." And he was utterly fascinated by this drawing or this poster, and he wanted to know immediately where I got it. And, he wanted one for his apartment. So I told him he could have this one. Somebody who knew who all the brothers were should actually take it. So if we start on our handout going right, so we start from Jesus, who's in the blue. Okay. And then there's Malcolm X. Okay, so I've given on this little handout, I've given you little thumbnail sketches of who these people are. And if I'd gotten organized earlier, I would have talked to Pastor John and Sarah earlier, and we would have asked the Luther League and say the 5th and 6th graders to come in and actually act out this, and they could each take a different person and tell us a little bit about who they are. But that'll have to wait for a time when I'm better connected in the church. Okay, so we've got Malcolm X, and then we have W.E.B. Du Bois. He's here, this is W.E.B. Du Bois. I had a little trouble IDing him at the first, but then I looked for a later picture of him online, and he did put on a few pounds as he aged. Then we go on and we have Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was an American educator, author, orator, and advisor to several presidents of the United States. He's of the last generation of African-American leaders who was actually born into slavery. And he, let's see, which is the Tuskegee Institute is where he worked out of. So he was interested in increasing the technical skills and learning of African-American people in the United States so that they could move into society and have better jobs.
I'll just mention, this is Mark for people
Yeah.
online. A month ago, I was there in Tuskegee and at Carver's and Washington's graves. And unfortunately, the Park Service had had a busy weekend in Selma. It's a National Park Service runs some of the things there, the programs. And so the museum was closed, but just to be there and then also to drive out to the airfield and knowing the medical history, but also the military history of Tuskegee. I highly recommend it if you travel in the South. I've never been there.
Yeah, that's exciting. And then we go, I'm sure it'd be a wonderful place to go.
Alabama, about 30 minutes east of Montgomery.
Yeah. And then we move on to the great film star, Paul Robeson. You all remember Old Man River? He was also very active in civil rights and working to aid other people in, who were Black. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All righty. So he's the gentleman standing up, upper right corner. And then I made a mistake in my identifications. So I've written in Nat Turner, and his is the last entry. He's just past, sitting down, just past Paul Robeson. Yeah, and that's Nat Turner. He was the leader of the Great Slave Rebellion. And yeah, that was quelled violently. And he escaped and hid for 6 weeks, but then he died a terrible death. But he is very much remembered within the Black community. And then there is a gentleman I had never heard of, and that's the noble Drew Alley, who founded the Moorish Science Temple of America. Yep, yeah, with the hat or the fez. And then seated in the red and white, we have Frederick Douglass, who was also born into slavery and escaped and became a great orator. And yeah. And then across from that is Nkrumah. His name is Nkrumah. Have any of you watched The Crown? Okay, so in season 2, when Elizabeth goes to Africa, to Ghana, this is the guy that she danced with. He was the first president of the liberated Ghana, and he was also, I think, the first president of the Pan-African Union. You know, his is a very interesting life, although he sort of went to the dark side because he instituted a very autocratic rule and then was ousted. And he lived out his life, I think, in Guinea. Then we move to Martin Luther King. Yep. And we all know a bit about him. I just listened to a wonderful podcast not too long ago. Ezra Klein did a podcast on Martin Luther King for Martin Luther King Day, interviewing a scholar. And then it's Elijah Muhammad, who was an American religious leader, Black separatist, and self-proclaimed messenger of Allah, who led the Nation of Islam until his death in 1975. He was a mentor and teacher of Malcolm X, Louis Farrakhan, Muhammad Ali. And then seated next to Elisha Muhammad is Harriet Tubman, the great worker in the Underground Railroad. And next to her is Mary Beth McLeod Bethune, who actually was an advisor in the administration of FDR. And she founded the National Council of Negro Women in 1935. So she was a very influential woman working in the civil rights movement and in politics at actually a very, very high level. She was part of what was called the Black Cabinet for Roosevelt during the Depression and the war years. And next to Mary Beth, we have Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who was a Jamaican political activist, publisher, journalist, entrepreneur, and orator.
And can I just mention that his son, who knew he had a son, Dr. Julius Garvey, was part of the Oak Park Speaker Series earlier this year at the Guild Theater and in fascinating dialogue with Kevin Johnson. And they had a book signing for a little paperback, the writings of Marcus Garvey. And what's not in your write-up is there's a lot in there about his Christian faith.
Okay, well, that I did not know. I only had time to find their pictures and try to sort out who they were and then edit the intro paragraph to their Wikipedia pages. That's all I had time. And then the person seated down there is Judas. Yeah, Judas in white next to Jesus. Nat Turner is the one. Nat Turner is the guy with his hand out, I think. I think all the people who are represented actually have faces, and Judas and Jesus do not. That would make sense. Okay, hang on a second, Ernie.
Everything seems to be so smoothly with the body parts, but the head of the third man from the left, seated on the side in the red robe. That head looks like it's been cut by a chainsaw and stuck on the body. To me, it just doesn't belong there.
Oh, yeah, he. Yeah.
This is pre-Photoshop.
It is really interesting to see that because he's such a towering figure in our understanding. So is there anyone here that you were expecting to see that you didn't? We don't have George Washington Carver here. Yeah, we don't have Medgar. Yeah. So there are, we don't have Jesse Jackson here. There are a number of people who could be seated at this banquet who aren't here, but it's a wonderful representation of the Last Supper. And it is, yeah, here you can just lay it down there. I think this was the early 80s. Yeah, it's very, very difficult to find out any information about either the artist or the date that it was painted. But yes, okay.
What's the significance of the bowl? Is that wine or?
Oh,
Lower
up
right-
front,
yeah.
at the beginning of a banquet, always they both wash their feet and their hands. So to prepare to eat. And because they'd been walking outside always, they always washed their feet. So at the start of the Last Supper, Jesus washed all the disciples' feet. So I didn't, I had to cut out the scenes just to put in enough artwork. But I think it's a very powerful, it's different. If you were here for the Annunciation classes, we did look at Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper when we were learning about perspective. How when the railroads come together. So infinity, yeah. So this is a very different way. Yes, Ingrid.
Oh, you could finish your thought.
Okay, it's a very different portrayal, but since we'd already looked at Da Vinci, I thought we'd try out some very, very different presentations, the Blake and then the Barnes, for this, this scene that we remember every week in communion. Yes.
Oh, so I was just going to say, since Mark Carlson always jumps in with cultural opportunities, that I would throw one in of my own. This is an advertisement. No, well, it is kind of the B Street Theater, housed at the Sophia Center for the Performing Arts, is, I just recently found out, they are holding, I believe it's just a 2-man play, and it's called The Meeting, and it's a conversation between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So that is going to be various times next weekend. So if you want to check that out, I myself am going. So it sounded like it would be super interesting. So there you go. It's called The Meeting, once again, at the B Street Theater, which is held over there at the Sophia Center.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Yeah.
The building in the back.
Oh,
centered in the
I
back,
think that
framed.
that is, it's either the Capitol or it is St. Peter's Basilica. It,
Yeah.
it has that dome shape.
The dome building.
So it's one or the other. Okay, let's move on to Gethsemane. And this is from the Cameroon. So if you remember the Duccio, I talked about that being a great site for teaching Sunday school. In the Cameroon, there was a missionary, a French Catholic missionary, who decided that it would be much easier to teach the story of Jesus if he had available to him scenes of the life of Jesus that were done from the perspective of the people actually living in the Cameroon. So we're talking about translating the message. So, when we were looking at it, when we look at Italian art, everybody looks like they're Italian. When we look at Flemish art, everyone looks like they're Flemish. When we look here in the Cameroon, everyone looks like they're from the Cameroon. And there are 66 paintings that are part of this series, and the images are housed at Vanderbilt Divinity School, which is where I was able to access this. So how is this different in understanding in terms of the Garden of Gethsemane?
You only see Jesus praying. He's hanging on a
Right,
rock.
and Jesus prayed, but then actually in the story, he
His
asked his
disciples, yeah,
disciples to stay
fell
awake
asleep,
and
yeah.
pray with him, and they kept falling asleep.
Yep.
So he kept
And this-
going and
yeah.
waking them up
Yeah.
and then praying more. And
Very
it went
true.
on and on and on. So here, the disciples who are falling asleep are portrayed.
So having just been in the Garden of Gethsemane, I'll tell you something our tour guide told us, which I experienced. In the garden, which is still there with olive trees that were around when Christ was there, we know the spot. This is a place we know where it was. It's a weird part of Jerusalem where there's always a breeze. And so the disciples were fond of coming there to sleep because it had a really nice breeze. It would kind of lull you to sleep in what can be a hot area. The wind just kind of blows through this garden. So it's a very peaceful spot.
Yeah, now let's look at a far more conventional image of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay, this is done by a German artist, Heinrich Hoffmann. And this is undoubtedly his most famous painting. And now it is housed in the Gethsemane Chapel at Riverside Church in New York. It was purchased by John Rockefeller Jr. For that church, who also purchased the others. Interestingly, originally it was bought by a man named John Zyla, who lived in San Francisco. And in the great earthquake of 1905, this is the only piece of art that was rescued from his house. So it has a provenance that includes San Francisco and that great event in the history of California. And then it was purchased at a later date by John Rockefeller Jr., who was, one of the wealthiest men in the country, if not the wealthiest. He was the only child of John Rockefeller Sr. So how many of you have seen this in a Sunday school book? Yeah. Yes, Ernie?
Yes. The focus of the hands on this picture and the hands in the previous picture showed the inside of the palm of being extremely white, which is what it should be,
Yes.
as opposed to the figures that were there asleep on the side, but they did not show the sole of the feet of those who are asleep, which would also be the same color as the inside of the hand and the palm.
Right. The darker pigment is not as heavy on the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand. I also just would briefly like to point out sort of this unholy light of the halo here, and then the light coming from the heavens above. Really sort of a spotlight right upon Jesus, really giving this the sense of holiness that it still has today. This is perhaps one of the most copied pieces of art ever in the history of art representations. And this is on view. And John D. Rockefeller Jr. bought it for Riverside, and he gave it to the church, saying that a work this powerfully beautiful that represents such a holy scene should always be available to the public. So the rest of the artwork, the other 3 paintings by Hoffman, are on display in cases in one of the hallways at Riverside, but this is in the Gethsemane Chapel. Yes, I need Carolyn.
Why the color of Jesus's robe as a umber, golden yellow or yellow gold?
Yeah, and here he's really using shading to do a contrast for where the light hits from the sort of redness of the robe below, and then showing where the light hits Jesus's robe. And there it moves to a more golden yellow color. Now I want to show you how this particular painting is used to translate the message in a very, very different culture. So let's move on to the next slide. This actually is a piece of art that I actually own. It was commissioned by my grandfather in Madagascar. And I believe that it's based on the Hoffman painting. The profile of Jesus is exactly the same. This is what's called a bas-relief. It's in Highland mahogany. And the interior of the frame is actually in rosewood. It's a very different grain. So in Madagascar in 1934, which is when this was done, one of the teachers at the missionary children's home had bought one of these from Mr. Rantanteli, who was an artist, and she had given him, my father thinks, a picture from a Sunday school book, and then he had carved this image. Bas-relief images are very, very common in Madagascar. Their skill level is very high. And it looks very much like the Hoffman. The one difference is if you get up, and I was going to bring it in, but I didn't have the energy. If you get up close, which is why I've given you the close-up here, you see that the faces of the disciples do not look like they're Italian or like they're Jewish. They actually look like Malagasy tribesmen. So this is a watercolor by an artist named Emile Rolambo, which Grandpa also bought. And I've given you a close-up of that so that you could see sort of how they looked in 1930 actually, he bought this in 39. And what the villages were like, but what the typical Malagasy would actually have looked like at that time. And this is in southern Madagascar. These are either part of the Andrui or the Anoshi tribes. How is this one different than the Hoffman?
The tree is very prominent.
Yeah, the trees are very prominent. And so he's added that, and he's in a touch of artistic license, I think you could say. He's also arced this one up over to really.
Is it a particular tree that's like
A-
native there?
And I have asked two people that I know, my father might be able to ID it, but I asked Dr. John Toso, who was born there and who actually worked there as a physician for many years. And I also asked my cousin Margaret, and they just think that they're regular trees. They couldn't identify them, for sure. But Dr. Toso very kindly gave me a hint as to the woods that would have normally been used in these kinds of artwork. Yes, Ernie?
The clumps on the tree look very much like the disease on the trees that we see today, where the, I've lost the word for the mistletoe, which is an infection, a disease infection on the tree. And the mistletoe grows in clumps like that. And you can visualize that, and that's what I flashed on.
Yeah, and it does sort of look like mistletoe. Actually, when I was trying to ID this, it does look a little bit like a very particular kind of baobab tree that would be found in this part of Madagascar. So he has once again contextualized this scene from Jesus's life. He's left Jesus looking very much like he was portrayed in the Hoffman painting. But he has contextualized the rest of the scene.
Yeah, and if I didn't say this earlier, in the garden were famously these olive trees, which are really knobby and gnarly and not like this height.
Yeah, not like this at all. They're much fatter with respect to their trunks. So we're moving through. These are the most different images I've sort of thrown in to expand our understanding of Christian art. Now we're moving to some more traditional images. This is the Giotto, who was a contemporary of Duccio, working in a different city. This is Padua, I believe. And this is the kiss of Jesus. So here we have Judas, here we have Jesus, here we have Peter cutting off the ear of the Roman slave. And we have all the torches. And this is a fresco in the Scrovani Chapel in Padua, which was part of a monastery, which would have been an even better site for Pastor John to teach Sunday school. So let's move on to the next one. This, we have two ladies in our group here who are from Cologne. And so I decided to include the last two pieces of art are actually German, and they're fairly famous. This, is it Gero or Gero? How do you say that properly in the German, ladies? Gero? Gero? Okay, Geru, okay. Gero. Okay, well, and then I'll try to say the name of the church properly. Hohe Domkirche Sankt Petrus. Did I do okay, ladies? Or did I think, yeah. Petrus, yeah. Been a long time since I had German. And I worked hard to find the German name for the Cologne Cathedral. This is one of the most famous cathedrals in the world. It is once again a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is huge. It is, pardon? It's enormous is what Elsa is saying. And it's incredibly beautiful. This is the oldest piece of art in our presentation today. This is from 965 to 970. It was commissioned by Archbishop Garrow, who is represented here in the illuminated manuscript from a German abbey, Reichenau, and that's dated circa 969. It was commissioned for a different use, but Archbishop Garrow also, they're laughing at me. Okay, I'll just call him the Archbishop. He commissioned that a new cathedral would be built. So he commissioned the building of the Cologne Cathedral, which we can see now, and which I've seen. And sometime when we have more time, I'll tell you a story about my dad, who was in Cologne in 1939 at the start of the war. On his way back to very before the war broke out. This was a very innovative piece of art in its day. It, in the Christian tradition during the Middle Ages or the early Middle Ages, there were very few rounded sculptural images of Christ or of any of the saints. That was considered to be too pagan. So the Archbishop commissioned this, and this was really a radical departure at this time to do a sculpture, a three-dimensional work of Jesus. It was also very unusual to represent the dead Jesus rather than the living Jesus. So you can really see here that Jesus has died. You can see his taut arms. And then you can also see this distended stomach. And I gave a close-up there so that you could see that. This is actually one of a very, very famous piece of Christian art. And it's always on view at the Great Cathedral. What are we, and this backdrop, you know, the rays, that was was added later during the Baroque period. So that's a fairly recent addition to the cross. So it would have been far more compelling in its original version, and it's sort of been dolled up now in a later presentation, but that's the way that it's shown at the Great Cathedral. Okay.
I like it because it's, you know, light was what was left in Jesus when his body died. And that there's the light. And I love it.
Yeah. Anyone else?
The headpiece behind Jesus is almost carried out in the theme of the additional radiated plaque.
Yeah.
The spokes are there for my vision anyway. It just seems like it completes it now, and this is the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah. And my guess is that those are gemstones of some kind, large gemstones surrounding really the crown of Jesus Christ.
How big? So this is quite big.
This is, I think, 6'2". That's the
Whoa.
height with the arms go across 5 feet, 5 inches. So this is a very large sculpture.
Yeah.
Has anyone been to the Cologne Cathedral and seen this?
Oh, it's closed. No, it's
Oh
closed.
dear. How about Elsa and Helvi? Have you been here?
Say that again.
The church in Cologne never finished in all its years of existence. And the war made it, damaged it very much. And probably the pictures might even have been stored away at the time when I had a chance to go in there. And if
Yeah.
you have children with you, you don't see.
Yeah,
all
no,
the
you
things
don't
you
have
see
much
in the
time to see
bookstore.
much. Yeah. Well, anyway, I thought we'd include this one. Our last piece of art is the Techen altarpiece by the great 19th century German Romantic painter, David Friedrich Caspar. This, once again, is a rather unusual piece of art, and it was very somewhat controversial at the time. Caspar also designed the frame, and it appears to be leaning to the left a little bit, and I don't quite understand that. But here the frame is very significant as well. This is the eye of God, surrounded by these radiating beams, very similar to the cross that was commissioned by the Archbishop. We have the sheaf of wheat on one side, and we have the grapes on the other, symbolizing communion. Then we have the sort of Greek or Roman pillars going up, and at the top we have 5 angels and a star. So it draws your attention all the way up, and it's heavily laden with religious symbolism. What do you notice that's different about this scene? This is also a very, very large piece of art. And it was commissioned by a private individual for his private chapel.
The other 2 men are missing.
Yeah, the other 2 men are missing. This is just a stark representation. And Caspar was criticized at the time because this is not necessarily a realistic portrayal. So he's changed sort of a linear space, and he's changed the sort of the real depiction of how this would have looked to emphasize the scene. Okay. Oh, okay. And it is a cross, yeah, and there
Is
is.
the cross higher than the trees? The cross is higher than.
It's
the trees.
higher than the trees. It's a very unlikely setting for a crucifixion. Yes, Helvi?
The trees, pine trees, no, fir trees.
Yeah, fir trees. And my recollection of being at this spot, there were not fir trees in Jerusalem at this spot.
Yeah, this is nothing, it's not a real situation. Be far more the kinds of trees that you would see in Germany or in certain portions of Germany. And it's high upon a hillside. There are 5 beams of light radiating out from this rock.
Can you show us the
Yeah,
5? Because I see
1,
3.
2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, okay.
They go all the way around in array. The
Yeah.
3 are more visible. You know, we're
Yeah.
working from a
Yeah,
photo
exactly.
and that's blown up in a large scale. The sky, yes.
Just thinking if it's so high like that, I can't picture how the people would have climbed up there because Mary was supposed to be at the bottom of the cross.
Yeah, it's not a realistic portrayal, but it's a very, very effective altarpiece because you're sitting in church and you're looking up really at the cross, and it's front and center. And it has a real drama to it, and it has an ethereal beauty to it as well.
Dresden was severely damaged during the war, and I thought there was nothing left, so maybe it was stored away.
Yeah, I have read about, I've actually been to Dresden when I was studying at the Goethe Institute in Munich or in München. And all the artwork was stored, I think, in salt caves or some kind of caves so that it was protected during the firebombing of Dresden, and it was safe. Yes, Mary?
Yeah, the side view of Jesus kind of disturbs me because I would love to see the face of Jesus, really. If I were in a church, I would love to see him.
Yeah, and this is a private chapel rather than a public church. So it could be more just for the one specific patron rather than being for a large worship setting.
In a way, Mary, for me, I had a different take on that feeling. For me, it was like the idea that, I don't know how to say it. So you're kind of behind and a little distant from where Jesus is. And just imagining, I almost always imagine it from the front, but it kind of rounds out the experience. Like, you could have been all around. There could have been passerbys that experienced this without the intention of being there. So in a way, it has this feeling for me of like, whoa, I'm about to maybe approach something holy from like the distance. I don't know, just a different emotion.
Okay, well, I am conscious of the time and that some of us at least are trying to get up to church for the 11:15 service.
I want to
Thank-
interrupt real quick and say, can we give Janet a round of applause for her wealth of knowledge and, I mean, just really excellence.